Good afternoon and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first Black, Brown and Green Voices programme for the academic year 2022-2023. Gosh, I can't believe I'm mentioning 2023 already. I'm Dr. Miriam Nyhan-Gray, and I'm honoured to be with you today to share in a conversation with a remarkable person, Dame Elizabeth Anionwu. Today is Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States and World Mental Health Day, and I can't think of a better way to spend a day of reflection like this than with Dame Anionwu, who I will refer to as Elizabeth during the interview. She has quite kindly given me that permission. Before I hand over to my NYU colleague and African American Irish Diaspora Network colleague, Professor Kim DaCosta, to introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to thank the team at Luxman Ireland House NYU and my colleagues at the African American Irish Diaspora Network for their support in mounting this programme. If you'd like some information on either institution, it's in the chat function there for you. I'd also like to thank our promotional partners, NYU's John Brademas Center, especially Tom McIntyre and Polly Terzian, and at New York Public Library Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, especially to Sonia Richards and Joy Bivens for their support with these programs also. Today's conversation will run for approximately 75 minutes. We'll try to take some questions from you, so please don't be shy. This probably won't be the first time I will say this, but I want to start off by saying what a pleasure it is to read Dreams from My Mother, and I highly recommend it, and I hope that we have ample time to talk in depth with Elizabeth about this wonderful memoir. Now let me hand over to my wonderful colleague and friend, Professor Kim DaCosta, with whom I've collaborated on some of these activities at NYU and through the African American Irish Diaspora Network. Over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Well, I have the pleasure of introducing Dame Anionwu, who was born in Birmingham in 1947 and identifies herself as of Irish Nigerian heritage, and started to work for Britain's NHS as a school nurse's assistant at the age of 16. In 1979, she helped to establish in Brent the first nurse-led UK sickle and thalassemia screening and counseling center. In 1988, she was awarded a PhD from University College London. And from 1990 to 1997, she worked at the Institute of Child Health, UCL, as a lecturer, then senior lecturer in community genetic counseling. She's written extensively and is a co-author with Professor Carl Atkin of The Politics of Sickle Cell and Thalassemia. She was honored with a damehood in the 2017 Queen's New Year's Honors List for her services to nursing and the Mary Seacole Statue Appeal. In 2004, she was presented with the Royal College of Nursing Fellowship for her work in the development of nurse-led sickle cell and thalassemia counseling services and education and leadership in transcultural nursing. She is a patron of the Sickle Cell Society, the Nigerian Nurses Charitable Association, and the Sickle and Thalassemia Association of Nurses, Midwives, and Associated Professionals. And she's chaired several projects for the NHS Sickle and Thalassemia Screening Program. Her memoir, Dreams from My Mother, was recently reissued, and we hope you can get it soon in the US in print, but certainly we look forward to the discussion today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kim. Great to have you here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Elizabeth, again, welcome, and it's such a pleasure. And I should say that it is Black History Month in Ireland as well this month, as well as in the UK. So it's a really nice timing for us to be speaking to you as part of the programming. Would you mind, for people who are and I want to ask you a little bit about, or not a little bit, quite a lot about your professional journey. But could we start off a little bit on 1947, the context of how this wonderful confluence of Irish and Nigerian heritage in the UK comes together, and tell us a little bit about your origin story, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much indeed. And I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm so excited to be communicating, conversing with you all across the pond, so to speak, via Zoom. I am now 75 years of age, and I was born, as you've alluded to, in 1947, and I was the outcome of an affair between my parents whilst they were both students at Cambridge University in England. My mother was in her second year studying classics, and my mother is the Irish parentage, and my father was Nigerian, and he was literally completing his law degree at the same university. I never knew my father. I had my mother's maiden name, Furlong, good old Irish surname. And maybe if I talk about my mother's Irish heritage.
That would be great. I was going to ask you that. That would be great.
Fine. So my mother's family was Furlong, and when I was researching for my memoirs, I found this wonderful Dublin genealogist who was able to help me go right back to 1840 in respect of my grandparents' Irish history. So both my maternal grandparents were born in Liverpool, England in 1896. Their parents were immigrants from Ireland to Liverpool. It looked around about 1870s. The families are, some of the names are Furlong and Kehoe. And my grandfather's family came from County Wexford. And my grandmother's, this is my maternal grandmother, came from County Down. It's the Wexford family history that I know more about. And there was one very interesting discovery for me from a letter that I received from my cousin, who had received it from our mutual great aunt, Aunt Kate. And she had set out a little bit more of the family history for us. And one of my, I would be a great grandparent, was John Furlong in Wexford. And he was a hedgerow school teacher. Now, I had not actually heard about this, but I soon did find out that this was during the time when it was illegal for Catholic children in Ireland to be taught, to go to the local schools. So this ancestor of mine, who was the school headmaster, he was teaching the children illegally in the hedgerows in the countryside. And if he got caught, he could have been jailed, could have been deported to Australia, might even have been killed. So it was very, very courageous thing for somebody to do. So I was quite proud when I read about that, actually. So that's the Irish ancestry. I don't know whether you want me to say any more about that, or
well, maybe what I'd love to get a sense of from you, if it was okay, how much, so how Irish was the sensibility of your mother? And my understanding is that you go to live with your grandparents for a protracted period of time, and that kind of brings you, ironically, in a way, closer to some of that heritage in a way. Can you tell us a little bit
Yes,
about that
certainly.
journey?
So I talk about my mother first. And by the way, it would have been my mother's birthday today.
Oh,
And
wow.
she was born in the same year as the late Queen Elizabeth II.
Wow.
And so my mother would be 96 if she was still alive. She would
Wow.
have a, so I think that I thought I would mention that to you today.
That's amazing.
Because it is through my mother's heritage is where the Irish ancestry is. So now when I talk about my mother's experience of becoming pregnant while she's at university, not married, so the stigma that, right? Because my grandparents were very loving, my maternal grandparents were extremely loving, very devout Catholics. And so my mother couldn't bring herself to tell them that she was pregnant. She was so ashamed. And also my mother was the first one to go to university in the family and to go to Cambridge University. I mean, I could just imagine, you know, the rejoicing there would have been.
Absolutely.
And so it was when she went home during the vacation period, and my grandmother said, because my mother was apparently 6 months pregnant by now, and my grandmother said, "Are you pregnant?" And my mother said, "Yes." "When were you going to tell us?" And my mother said she wasn't. She was going to go to the local river and jump in and drown, because she couldn't bring herself to disclose this pregnancy, where she knew not only her dreams would come crashing down, but so would her parents. And they had been very loving towards her, very helpful. So I often say one thing though, my mother's experience was not like Philomena's experience. We know the very famous story of Philomena now. There's a book and then a film. And it was actually the Catholic Church rallied round my mother's family, maybe because they saw that this was a clever girl. She was at, you know, a prestigious university. These were devout Catholic family. My grandfather was a friend of the local parish priest, you know, so I think all of that helped for my mother not to be condemned. In fact, they bent over backwards, as we say, to try and organize for my care so that my mother would continue her studies. But my mother refused to continue her studies because she didn't feel she could have the career she wanted to in those days and keep me, because she was just adamant she was not going to give me up for adoption. And I always thank my mother for that.
And all of that is in the context of her not disclosing who your father was, correct?
Quite right, Miriam, absolutely right. So there was an assumption that a white baby would be born, and there was an assumption, I think, that it was a white student at the Cambridge University. So come the day that I was born, or a few days afterwards, I was in a Catholic maternity hospital in Birmingham, England, run by nuns. And apparently my grandparents came to see me, and the nun stopped them from coming into the room where my mother and I were to alert them. And this was the way she did it, because it's gone down in our oral history as this. To be sure, the baby's a little dark. And that was just to warn them, this was not a white baby you're going to see. And there was I, apparently, brown-skinned, with a big afro, even as a baby. So there was no disguising. And as you mentioned, my mother had not spoken about my father to anybody. She certainly hadn't told them that he was Nigerian. So the first knowledge they had was when they looked down in the crib, well, and saw me. And my mother refused to say anything about my father for some time. I think she must have been in such a frightened, shocked situation. But you are asking me about my my contact with Irish culture. And one of the reasons it was from childhood was I spent my first 9 years in a Catholic children's home run by nuns. Mostly pleasant experiences. There were some unpleasant experiences due to my skin color, but overall it was pleasant. And one of the reasons I thoroughly enjoyed my time there was that I was taught to play the piano by one nun, and I was selected with a small group of children to do Irish dancing. And I have the most incredible memories. I mean, you know, there's a song, Brown Girl in the Ring.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, that was me. I was the brown girl in the ring. And it attracted a lot of attention because we would go on little dancing tours in the West Midlands where the children's home were. And I got a lot of applause for my dancing. I loved it. I really, and I remember though, often I would get money pressed into my hands by the adults that were there. And then the nuns would take the money off me and I never saw it again. So I got a bit cross about that. Having said that, so that was the biggest influence in terms of my Irish heritage as a toddler up to the age of 9.
And was that positive? Was it a
That
positive?
was positive, yes, because I was taught Irish tunes on the piano. And I did the Irish dancing, and I did a lot of Irish dancing. And I was a bit of a show off because, you know, we would get dressed in our lovely Irish dancing costume and our buckle shoes. I was, yeah, you know, well, you know, did I have a sense of rhythm from both sides? I have no idea. But I could do a reel, I could do a solo. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And to this day, I really enjoy watching Irish dancing. So that was my first introduction. Then I went to live with my mother and my stepfather, but only for 20 months. That was a more traumatic experience, not because of my mother. She was wonderful, but she didn't realize that my stepfather, who was white, was being teased by his friends in the pub where they went to drink. What was he doing, allowing his woman to have a half-caste child in the house? This was a term, I don't know whether this is a term, you know, this is a term that we don't really hear now.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was a very common term. We're talking about the 1950s England now, just to put it in historical context. And I was, my stepfather, when my mother wasn't around and when he'd had a tipple, used to physically abuse me. And it got so bad that my mother discovered it and called upon her parents, my maternal grandparents, now living in the northwest of England, to help. And they rescued me. So from the age of just, I think I was 10 and a half, I went up to the northwest of England to stay with my maternal grandparents. Now, I just love my grandparents, and particularly my grandfather. I had a very close relationship with him. And he would tell me stories about Irish politics because we had a lot of records in the house, my grandparents' house. And one of them was the wearing of the green. And I was humming this song, and I used to go for walks with my grandfather. He'd tell me, he was a lovely storyteller. And he said, I heard you playing that tune, that record. He said, do you know what it's about? Somebody wearing green. He said, no. It was when it was the Irish were denied the opportunity to wear shamrock. it was illegal. So this was a rebel song. He was the one that taught me about rebel songs. I didn't know anything about it. He was a civil servant, upright, standing, you know, but he knew his Irish history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was very pleased that I, you know, was able to enjoy.
And you were interested.
Yes, yes. And so that's really where, and then with my grandmother, the Irish cooking, soda bread and all of that. So I had my second tranche of Irish cultural experience living with my grandparents up till the age of 16. So I looking back, I think I was very fortunate that I had this injection of and by the way, going back to my grandparents' house, that's where I listened to John McCormack. They had all his records. And I remember this LP that was there, and it had this gorgeous photo of John McCormack with his beautiful eyes and smile looking out at you. And so that's where I got introduced to a lot of Irish folk songs, which I now have on my phone. So when I'm walking, I'm still listening to some of this.
Yeah.
So I hope that gives you an idea of where the influences came from for me.
Would you mind if I asked you, Elizabeth, when your grandparents kind of rescued you, as you say it, were they welcoming, and how were they with you at this point? You're 9.5, 10. Were they more comfortable, you know, with you as this mixed race grandchild? How was that dynamic for them as you saw them navigate it, or was it apparent to you?
It wasn't really apparent in terms of my grandfather. He was just a very loving grandfather. I mean, I was a little bit scared of him, as I think, you know, he was very tall. He used to wear his hat and he smoked, but he was never cross with me. But I think, do you remember, I never really had a decent father figure. So I was a bit scared of men. Not surprising with what had happened with my stepfather.
Mm-hmm.
And in the convent when I was small, it was nuns. The priests were occasional visitors and they were treated like gods. You know, we were never allowed to go near the priest. You know what I mean? So my grandfather was the first wonderful man that I met that I can relate to. And my grandmother was very homely and motherly to me. But interestingly, I was very attached to two of my grandfather's sisters, so my great aunts. They lived in Liverpool, and they would have me for holidays every so often. And they were very, very religious, both of them. And one day I was out walking with one of them in Liverpool, and a neighbor stopped her to greet her. And my great aunt introduced me as an adopted child. And I thought, that's interesting. And it made me realize that they were loving, but they couldn't bring themselves to declare that actually I was a relative of theirs. So that made me realize, it's not straightforward at all. There is stigma attached to my skin color. And nobody ever spoke about my father, ever. You know, I mean, I wrote to my mother when I was 20, I think I was 25, to ask her about my dad. And that's when she wrote back and gave me all his details. So I grew up not knowing who my father figure was, my natural father figure.
So you didn't know that you were half Nigerian even when you were young?
No, I didn't, because as I said, nobody said anything. And I gradually started to get confused. Why was I brown skinned and all these other children in the children's home, particularly in the children's home, they were all white? And one day I washed myself 10 times to try and make my face white with harsh red carbolic soap. And I ended up in the sick bay because I have very sensitive skin. Now, that tells you straight away I was not comfortable in my skin, literally. I was not comfortable because every so often it would be pointed out to me. And I'll give you another story to show the idiocy of it all, to be very honest. In the convent, in the children's home, there was one nun who really liked me. I knew that. I think I was a little bit of a pet for her. And she chose me to, she was putting on this little drama for the children based on nursery rhyme characters. And so there was only about half a dozen of us that were included, or maybe 10 of us. And I was one of them. Yeah, I'll tell you, I'm a bit of a show off. Oh, I was so happy. And she chose me to be Humpty Dumpty. Another nun came and started arguing with this nun. I'd never seen nuns argue before. I remember that. The other nun was saying, Elizabeth can't be Humpty Dumpty because she's half caste. Fortunately, the other nun stood her ground and said, she is going to be Humpty Dumpty. And it was back and forth, back and forth. Anyway, she won. I was Humpty Dumpty. And I fell off that wall with such elan. Many, many years later, Miriam, somebody pointed out to me, but Humpty Dumpty was an egg. You can have white eggs, you can have brown eggs, and you can have dark brown eggs. So, and I thought, I wished as a child, but actually I don't think I could have said anything because they were quite strict. I think I would have had a bit of a smack if I had dared to intervene into this argument. Yes. So, yes. So there were examples like that I had.
So when and how, especially in the context, and this is something maybe not right away, you can come back to if you want, in the context of nursing in the UK, which, if I'm not mistaken, Elizabeth, you're in the realm of nursing, entering into a training, moving up when there are Irish nurses all over the place, presumably, and there are Black nurses. You know, it seems to have been quite integrated as a profession. But maybe for you first, where did the instinct come? I mean, how grateful we are that you went into that profession, but when did that, was it something you always wanted to do, or can you tell us a little bit about that?
Certainly can. I decided I wanted to be a nurse. I think I must have been around 4 or 5 years of age, and I was in the children's home. It was Nazareth House Children's Home, okay, in Birmingham. The reason was I suffered very badly from eczema, you know, in the armpits, behind the knees. And I would go to the sick bay in the children's home, and I would peep around the door to see which nun was going to do my dressing. The nun I was looking for, in my mind, I called her the white nun. Well, all the nuns were white. But this particular nun wore a white habit rather than the traditional black habit. If it was any of the other nuns, they didn't seem to know how to change my dressings, because I would have applied coal tar paste in those days, lovely cooling paste. Then they'd put gauze on it, because I was very observant. I was watching everything they were doing. And then they would put bandage around it. So my arms and my legs. That was wonderful. However, it was when it came to changing the dressings that I got scared. And that's why I would be looking around the door to see if my favorite nun was going to do it. And it was the nun with the white habit. Because the other nuns, they just used to tear off the bandage, tear off the gauze. The gauze would have stuck to the coal tar paste, which had stuck to my skin. And the way they took it off, it tore the skin off. And it would be bleeding and painful. And I can still feel the pain, honestly. The white nun, she would do something different. She would use what we now call distraction therapy, because what she would do she'd be joking with me, and she'd be using words that I thought were very, very rude. Don't forget, I was in a very religious environment. What was the word? Bottom. As a small child, I thought this was one of the rudest words in the world. And I would burst out laughing. And whilst I was laughing, she would take my dressing off and I wouldn't feel any pain. And I never wanted to be a nun. No. But I did want to be like this nun. So when I found out she was a nurse as well as a nun, that's when I decided I wanted to be a nurse. And I never swayed from that decision at all. And it was the best decision I made, I think.
So when you went through secondary school, I assume you were pretty academic and
Yes.
I mean, you liked school and everything. And
Yes. It was only when I was at secondary school. Now I was living with my grandparents now, and I obviously had been a very upset little soul with all the trauma that I'd had. But I was recovering with my grandparents and wonderful teachers. I love reading, and my grandmother wouldn't let me out of to go to a youth club. She was very strict. You know, my grandfather had died. It had depressed my grandmother, definitely. And she sort of took it out on me occasionally. But I was a bookworm, so, you know, and I was doing very well at school. And the teachers wanted me to stay on what we call sixth form, yes, so 16 to 18. And they knew that I wanted to be a nurse, but some of the teachers kept telling me, Elizabeth, you're university material. And in those days, when I was at that age, nursing in England was not taught in the universities. It was taught School of Nursing attached to a hospital. So, but I was very obstinate. I said, well, I want to be a nurse. And so they made sure I did the subjects. Looking back, I realized they made sure I was doing the subjects that would get me into university if I changed my mind. And I did get 7 O levels, as they were called then. But as I've said, I knew I wanted to be a nurse. So when I had to leave my grandmother's very suddenly at the age of 16, because apparently that's what she had agreed with my mother. She'd look after me till I was 16. Nobody told me. So that was a big wrench to suddenly go back to my mother and stepfather. I soon moved out of there and went and worked in a school for residential children with heart conditions, severe asthma. And there was a lovely school medical officer of health. And I applied to 3 what we call teaching hospitals in London, so quite famous hospitals actually. And I sent in the application form, they wanted to know the name of your father. I had to leave that blank in those days, name of your father, and occupation of your father. I had to leave that blank because, yeah, I didn't know. And then you had to send a photograph. So there's a photograph of me. I listed all my qualifications. I never heard back from any of those teaching hospitals. And this school medical officer of health, he was furious with them. He said, anyway, he really was. So he gave me the name of another hospital, and I think he gave me a reference as well. And I got into that hospital, and that's when I started my school. So looking back, I think race could have been a factor in me not, because I had all the educational qualifications. I had more than I needed to get in those days. So what was why wasn't I contacted?
Well,
I don't know, but one can only, you know.
The irony is when you find out later that your father was the first Nigerian ambassador to Italy, how many girls applying had a father of that stature?
Yes, yes.
So how then, so first of all, for the uninitiated, what is sickle cell anemia and how did it become such a focus of your work, Elizabeth?
Yes, so this is where I'm extremely grateful to the United States of America, because I learned so much from coming over, particularly to Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, and Minneapolis in my travels. I came over my holidays and linked in with the the National Sickle Cell Foundation in the US, and they were so helpful. But anyway, I just wanted to acknowledge all the support and help I got from the United States. So sickle cell anemia is an inherited blood disorder that affects the hemoglobin inside the red blood cells. And a child that is born with the illness has to have inherited it from both parents. Those parents don't necessarily have to have sickle cell, the illness, but they must be what's called either a carrier or have the trait. So we take two parents, let's say they both have sickle cell trait, they're not affected by it, but every time they conceive a child, there's a 25% chance or 1 in 4 chance that each of their children could be born with sickle cell anemia, for example. Now, the child won't normally have problems until after the age of 6 months, but after that, their red blood cells, this is the child with the illness now, can change from the donut round shape to that resembling a farmer's sickle or a banana shape or a half moon. And they're sticky and they're rigid and they can block in the tiny blood vessels. And this is where the problems can start. From mild to excruciating episodes of pain, called the sickle cell painful crisis. They are vulnerable to infections such as pneumonia. There are a variety of problems that can affect virtually every organ of the body, from eyes, causing possible blindness even, to problems with the joints and for example, the hips and the shoulder joint. So it's a long-term chronic illness. There's much better treatment available now. There is bone marrow transplantation, which isn't the easiest of treatments, but in the old days you'd say there wasn't a cure, but there's possible cure. And there's also gene therapy, which again isn't, it's not straightforward to go into that, but there are much better, and there are some new drug treatments that are making the lives of those affected, the quality of their lives have improved, but it is still a long-term condition and still sadly can be fatal, but not in the degree it used to be. And I got interested in it because when I was a health visitor, a public health nurse in London in the early 70s, one of the families that I used to visit had a 9-year-old son with sickle cell anemia. And the mother, who I got on very well with and was able to advise her about nutrition and all sorts of public health issues. However, when she told me that her child had this illness, and she was now asking me, what could she as a mother do to try and keep her child out of hospital so much? And she was happy, reasonably happy with the pediatric care in the hospital, but she couldn't find answers to a lot of the questions that mothers and fathers and carers would ask. And I had to say to her, I can't help you, because I realized I had not been taught about sickle cell anemia in my nursing course or in my public health nursing course. And this was in the late 60s, early 70s in London. Now that made me angry, and I wasn't happy. Why wasn't I taught about this condition when it was a significant issue in cities like London and others? And around the same time, 1972, I found my father, which is a wonderful story in itself. And I then started to meet members of my Nigerian family, both in England, and also I started to go and visit Nigeria on holiday. And I then discovered I had a cousin with sickle cell anemia. So it came close to home then. I was interested in it from a professional point of view, a personal point of view, and a political point of view. I call it the 3 Ps. And political with a small p, but I was really angry. Why wasn't this condition taught about? And that's why I got interested. And it was when I came to visit my Nigerian relatives in America that I took the opportunity to visit the National Sickle Cell Charity in the United States. And that's where I got my education about sickle cell, in the US, not in England.
So, am I correct in thinking, Elizabeth, that sickle cell is more common in people of African descent? That's kind of the political part of it.
So let's go back to sickle cell trait, the parents who are the healthy carriers. Sickle cell trait, if you were living in the tropics where there's malaria, falciparum malaria type, it offers partial protection against malaria in childhood, which is good, as an advantage. So wherever you find this malaria, it's not just in parts of Africa, but it's in, for example, in India, the Middle East. That's where you can find sickle cell. And so if you take England, which is my knowledge, the majority of people with sickle cell disease have African Caribbean origin, but there are some white, blue-eyed, blonde individuals with the condition as well. So it's not linked to skin color, it's linked with historically where this type of malaria was. But when you get interethnic unions, if you like, let's say, just for example, you could have a black mother and a white father, or it could be the reverse. Let's say the black parent had sickle cell trait, healthy, but they could pass the sickle gene onto their child. Just if it's just from one parent, they can't, that's sickle cell trait. They don't have them. Now you take this child, somebody like myself, I could be carrier because my father could have passed it on to me. It can go down through my generation, however white my generations become. And also remembering that there are white people, for example, it's found in Greece. There are white people who have sickle cell gene. So I think people need to understand why it's more common in certain countries amongst the Black populations, such as in England, but that there are non-Black individuals, there are white individuals who have the condition. But in my country, in England here, that's a minority. The majority are brown, black-skinned individuals. So it's quite confusing for people. They think, I remember when I was a sickle cell counselor, somebody said, so you have to be black, and the blacker you are, the worse it gets. Is that true? And I said, no, that's not true. So you have to really understand the genetics, the inheritance pattern, as well as the origins of the condition.
That's a great way of explaining it in relation to the malaria aspect. Can I ask you to deviate a little bit, but not necessarily geographically? You, from my understanding, you had a lovely encounter with a lady from Benin in Paris who kind of awakened you politically. That latent Irish political gene and the Nigerian was woken up.
Yes.
And I believe you traveled to the US at one point as part of some of those political activities.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
I think it's a nice place to share that story, if you don't mind.
Now my short-term memory is not brilliant. I've got to try and remember the name of that wonderful
Bayard Rustin, is it?
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you so much. So, so we're talking about 1970, I think, and it was my first ever trip to the United States, and it was through the fact that I was a member then of the British Labour Party, and they had a scheme linking up with the Americans for Democratic Action, ADA. I don't know whether they're still. Anyway, so Americans for Democratic Action, it was called then. And as a result, I was able to go on, it was like an exchange trip, a fact-finding trip. It was linked with health, and it was so cheap, Miriam. I couldn't have afforded it otherwise. And so the trip entailed visiting New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. And I was the only Black person in the group going over from the UK. And as I've said, the first stop was New York. And we had this wonderful itinerary organized for us. And one of the visits was that we had a speaker, and one of those speakers was the great late Mr. Bayard Rustin. So he was giving us a condensed sort of history of the civil rights era in the United States. And when he finished, it was open for questions and discussion. And one of our group put our hand up and said, oh, you know, I do feel sorry for you. You know, I'm just grateful, though, that we've never had problems like that in England. And I saw Bayard Rustin's face, and I just wish there was a hole that would just open up and let me be swallowed. I was so embarrassed. But, you know, he came and he had this wonderful voice. It's quite slow speaking, quite deep, beautifully spoken gentleman. And he said, didn't y'all have something called the Notting Hill riots in the 1950s? Oh dear. Anyway, after the discussion finished, we were all getting our things together, I had this tap on the shoulder. And I looked up and he said, I'm an assistant to Mr. Rustin. He would like to speak to you. You have to remember, I was so shy, believe it or not, in those days. I was so wet behind the ears, as they say. And I was quite scared because you know, with what had just happened as well. So I went up to him and he just took me aside a bit and he said, can I ask you what you're doing with this group? And I started to speak to him. He said, oh, you're English. Yes. And then he said, look, you've got a good program. You're going to see a lot of things, you know, very supportive of what. But he said, you're going to Washington, D.C., aren't you? I said, yes. He said, would you be interested in me putting you in touch with some Black activists? I don't know whether he called it that or civil rights. I can't remember the term he used. I said, well, yeah, definitely. So good. And it wasn't in the cell phones then, it was a big phone, you know, he picked this phone up, but he took his phone book out, which was really big, and he was going through this and he rang a couple of people, and then he would check, what's your name? Where are you staying in Washington, D.C.? And I got my programs. Okay, he said, right. And he'd go back and talk to, and as a result, I got contacts, he gave me the contacts of a couple of people in Washington, D.C., civil rights activists, so that when I got to Washington, D.C., they took me around Washington. They said, we're taking you around our Washington. It was incredible. I mean, I was so lucky. I really was fortunate. And that gave me an additional education that I wouldn't, I mean, I valued what I got from the tour, but this was like the icing on the cake, definitely. And I went back to, I came back here, Miriam, a different person. And it was what was the trigger to me realizing I had to find out about my Nigerian culture. Well, I didn't even know, I think I would have known my dad was Nigerian then, but it wasn't long after that I wrote to my mom and asked for details about my father.
So as your you know, life has evolved, Elizabeth, and you know, you've dedicated so much to improving the lives of others through nursing and your research and publications and advocacy. And you describe very well there your kind of awakening in terms of like tapping into the Black side of you as you were finding out it was Nigerian. Did your kind of what would you say, affinity for Irishness coexist beside that as your life evolved? And I suppose that leads me to, you know, a question I want to ask, like, when is it 2016 when you're awarded the damehood? 2017. Here is this woman, you know, this Nigerian, Irish, English, proud Black woman, biracial woman. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? That must have been a surreal experience. And how was that experience in the context of your kind of years of work prior to that? If you know, I'm not asking that very well, but you know what I'm trying to get at.
The damehood, but what did you start by asking me?
Well, did the Irishness coexist with?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
You know,
what I was aware of as my life evolved, and I started to link in with both sides of my family, and living in London mainly. So I used to say to people, I wasn't born in Ireland. I didn't grow up in Ireland. I wasn't born in Nigeria, and I didn't grow up in Nigeria. I was born in Birmingham, England. I've moved around England and even did some training in Scotland as well. And I've settled for the biggest part of my life in London. But it was absolutely fantastic, as I've said already, when I got to know both sides of my family. And I'm so aware of the love and the obstinacy of my mother and all that she gave up to try and give me a better life, even though it didn't always work out, but she was always trying there. And then when I met my father, obviously I had to immerse myself in Nigerian culture because I had a lot to catch up on, Miriam, a lot. And, you know, but the similarities between those two cultures, as far as I've seen, the sense of humor amongst the Igbo Nigerian, because it's the Igbo ethnic group that my father's family is from. The sense of humor has helped me enormously when things are getting tough, to see the stupid, silly things that are going on. That it just helps you. But also, both countries were part of English colonial legacy, because even before I met my father, and even before I got well and truly aware of the Irish history, because, you know, I started reading about that, you know, as a young adult. That's a sort of fusion, that there's that who do you belong to, really? And I realize I'm a right little mixed up person. And it was like I saw it like a pendulum, that the pendulum was over to the Irish side, if you like, because that's all I knew. English, you know, I'm born and brought up in England, but I always remember as a child having that question that often people get asked if they don't look as though by some people they should be there, which was, where are you from, my dear? Now, I ask people where they're from. I don't think that question is a wrong question. And I remember as a small child saying to this lady, I'm from Birmingham, because I had this strong Birmingham accent. I'm from Birmingham. And I remember her wagging her finger like that in front of me. She said, oh, no. Where are you really from? Now, asking me at that age, where am I really from? And all I knew was Birmingham. That made me think, oh, hold on. She doesn't think I'm from here. And I quickly realized this must be due to my skin color. When I met my Nigerian family, obviously I felt that the jigsaw of my identity was now complete. And there's no doubt, Miriam, that in the euphoria of what I was discovering, the pendulum was sort of going that way towards the African, the Nigerian heritage, because it started to all make sense. But it has swung back. I'm not sure where it is really. You could say it's in the middle. but it depends on the experiences I'm having in the moment. If I find people are being anti-Irish, up will come my, not quite Fenian, but because I have studied the Irish, freedom struggle. I have studied that a lot. If I experience a racist encounter due to my skin color, or if people are being racist about Nigerians, per se, that, the Nigerian lion will start to roar. And I just think I'm quite comfortable with that. It's not straightforward. I think the most important thing is I'm very comfortable with who I am now, whereas I'm no longer that small child that was scrubbing their face, but I have a great love for the Irish culture, a great love for the Nigerian culture, but I recognize that I was born and brought up in England. So yeah, I don't know whether that helps answer.
No, it does, but can I ask you a quick follow-up question? You've beautiful photos of your daughter and your granddaughter in Dreams from My Mother. Do you talk to or did you talk to your daughter, or do you talk to your granddaughter about these influences?
Oh yes. I remember because my daughter's father was Nigerian. He's deceased now. And we didn't stay together. History repeating itself probably, but and I remember her when she was very small. she said to me, "Mommy, I'm half Irish, half Nigerian, and half English." I thought, okay, the maths is maybe a little bit, but I like that, and my granddaughter, her heritage is obviously my daughter. Her father is Turkish and English.
Oh wow.
So and she is well, I think it's said grandchildren have quite close relationships with their grandparents quite often, and that's certainly the case, and we're very, very close. She's 14, so her mother is a very good educationist with her daughter. She's she's aware of current affairs, and it looks like we think she should be a cartoonist because she's got a great sense of humor, and she uses it to draw cartoons about current affairs. Wow. So fingers crossed. So
we need more women doing that, and we certainly need more women of color doing that. That would be lovely.
That's true. That is true, Miriam. Yes.
Can I finish? I feel I wish we had another hour, and I hope that this is the first of other encounters that we have with you in this space. I want to finish off with invoking your mother. She lived long enough to see your professional success, Elizabeth. How did kind of the story end for you in terms of your relationship with her, with this journey that you had to go on? It was a journey that you had to make yourself in terms of your identity. And I hope that it finished in a positive way.
Oh, it definitely. My mother died. She was 77 when she died.
Oh wow.
She died in 2003, and she was very, very proud of all my achievements. And in fact, when I interviewed a lot of people for my memoirs, because I love reading about other people's memoirs and autobiographies. But sometimes when I'm reading certain autobiographies, I'm thinking, the person doesn't come out very well, and yet they're lauding themselves as fantastic. And I'm thinking, I wonder what other people might think of you. So I thought I didn't want to fall into that trap myself. So I interviewed 35 people that were family, friends, colleagues. And there was a very poignant contribution by my half-sister, but half-sister. So from my mother and my stepfather, one of those siblings. And she said that I led the life that Mum should have led. And I thought that really, so, I knew she saw me, well, 2003, I had become Professor of Nursing by then.
Wow.
So she was very, very proud, you know, and the more I learned about what she'd been through, because I discovered more after she died, to be very honest. Some I knew, but she wrote me a couple of letters when I wrote and asked her about her life. So I knew some of it. She was very, very, very proud, really very proud of me. Yes, yes.
I can see why. I'm going to bring Kim back on there very shortly, and we're coming close to the end of time, but if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to pop them in. We have Philip Tibbs here with us. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you can read that there on the screen. Are you able to see that?
I've just opened it up now. Thank you.
Nice to meet you, former senior healthcare sanitarian, NYC Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, graduate studies at University of Michigan School of Public Health,
Yes.
African American, Indigenous, Scots Irish,
Wow.
male formal zygote. Thank you for being with us, Philip, sorry. And he's asking a question there.
I met Dr. Linus C. Pauling as an undergrad at the Ohio State University circa 1985 CE. What does CE stand for? Did you ever meet him? No, but wow. Gosh, he is so important, isn't he, in the history of conditions such as sickle cell disease. So wow, you met him, Philip. That's amazing. But no, I never met him. I've just read his works, his papers, and all the scientific contributions he made.
So from what you're saying, Elizabeth, I suppose, I guess because of the population in the United States has been the kind of mecca in terms of research into sickle cell, from what you're saying. Is that right?
Oh, I mean, the history that is mentioned in my memoirs. The history of I've fascinated as to how sickle cell disease really got onto the NHI. Have I got it right? NHI, National Health Institute, NIH. Sorry, I need my acronym. So that how sickle cell well and truly got onto the agenda of the National Institutes of Health agenda, and that's an amazing story. And I learned a lot from how, and I've always thought we were 30 years behind the United States, but you have to have influencers, you have to have people. And the story that I found incredible was there was a mother of a child with sickle cell anemia who wrote to NIH complaining about the lack of support for her and her child, and it landed on the desk of this gentleman in the NIH, if I'm right, whose father ran a television network station in Washington, DC, and he got talking to his father, and as a result, the first major fundraising event for sickle cell disease in Washington was organized, and that raised the profile. I'm sure others will know the story better than I, but I learned a lot of lessons from how the struggle to get sickle cell on the agenda. And I'm also watching how, right here, we're having to fight to get it back on the agenda because of a variety of issues. And it's not just because of the COVID pandemic, but, you know, we can't be complacent, particularly for minority health issues. Other issues will nudge them off the agenda if we're not careful.
May I ask you, and Kim, I don't know if you have any questions there. I'm trying to figure out how to bring you back on there, but of course,
Sure.
we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm so struck in listening to the arc of your story, Dame Elizabeth, how, you know, you so gracefully narrate the difficulties of growing up and the extent to which race played a role in you being accepted conditionally here and there. And I mean, as also a Black Irish child growing up in a pretty relatively tense place, Boston of the 70s and 80s. I know what that feels like, but what I really am struck by is that it rings true for me that if a child has some adult that they can trust, and you've noted a few along the way that you sort of sought out, identified, and they did rise to the occasion. You know, they treated you with love and compassion and care. It seems to me just so necessary, and I think helpful for younger people to hear, because you are so accomplished and seem so grounded. And I guess maybe it's just a comment, but I feel it's worth noting because I'm sometimes struck even today at the young people that I encounter who feel completely captured in the traumas that they've experienced and aren't able to, at least as young people, to cope with them in the ways that you seem to have done so well.
That's actually often that question, if you like, is often posed to me, and when I've looked back, because it takes other people to point this out to you sometimes, but I then fully realized what was happening, why I'm like the way I am, I think, when I read President Obama's first autobiography, Dreams from My Father. Because there's a section in it where he describes how I think he was working as a community activist in Chicago, and the person who had appointed him, I think, pointed out to him, oh no, he said, what's a middle class guy like you coming to do, you know, this sort of work? You could be, you know, high paid lawyer somewhere, whatever. President Obama describes this sensation of having a belly full of anger due to the issues he had encountered in growing up as mixed heritage, as we all know. And then it struck me then, it's how people like President Obama, and I now realize myself, I am not putting myself on the same pedestal as President Obama, but I did recognize that we had the same strategies for dealing with our trauma in terms of racism, I think. Because he talked about this belly full of anger that he had deep down within him. And I have had, and still have at times, deep-seated anger in my belly. And what I say to people who are seeking advice, or how come you've dealt with it so well? So, you know, look, anger, in my mind, creates energy. And that energy could be negative, and it could be positive. And I think somehow, maybe having these trusted individuals, people who've seen something in me and have wanted to help me up. Sometimes I've missed their cues and not realized they want to help, you know, black, white, male, you know, women and men. But that positive, the positive energy of the anger in me has driven me to work with others, just in certain areas. You can't take on the whole world, but certain areas like sickle cell, for example, and working as a team to actually try and improve the situation, because this anger can be very useful if you use it in an appropriate way. And when I mean appropriate, you don't have to decry who you are, you don't have to negate who you are, but you have to be able to navigate all these different settings in policy, in the healthcare system, from my experience, in the social scenario. There's times to get angry and there's times not to get angry. And I didn't always get it right. I've scared a few people around the table when I have suddenly exploded because I can't contain it anymore. But rather, like a pressure cooker, letting the air out slowly. And that air is the energy. And you use that energy to learn more about the conditions or the issues that you want to improve on, and explaining to people that might mean up until 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning sometimes. If you've got that energy that you want to change certain things, and you're working with like-minded people, and also you're getting love and appreciation from those people, those individuals, those organizations that you're within, that sort of can sort of calm you down, because you realize whilst you might be getting hate from this end, you're getting love from that end. And the love is the most important thing. And the accolades, when I say accolades, is when somebody says, you're doing well. I don't mean all the awards. That's, I mean, the awards are not very nice to get the awards, but, you know, and having to accept that racism, sadly, is always going to be around. This is my view. Racism is always going to be there. But working in organizations that say, you leave your racism at your door, your home door. You do not bring it into this organization. If you do bring it into this organization or workplace, these are the sanctions that you will have. That's what's made me realize, you know, if you can articulate those ideas and work with like-minded people and address all the bumps you get along the way, but also have your own toolkit, which is like music, good people to eat with, dancing, friendships. You know, I've come across something very recently, the last few days, a bit unexpected, so I'm still naive. It seems for certain people, I had the temerity, I'm on Twitter, and I tweeted that that I've enjoyed the latest episode of Meghan, Duchess of Sussex's Archetypes podcast.
Mhm.
Elizabeth, you know better.
I told you I was naive.
Wow.
Well, having said that, I've got 500 likes on that tweet as well.
Good.
And also, you use the technology. The mute button is tremendous. So all these, I just mute, 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 and they have sort of died down now. But that, when you, but you can see though, if young people are faced with that, or people who haven't got this sort of protective elements that we have in our toolboxes that we've learned by experience, how that can make them so angry and just mess up their own lives sometimes with their anger.
Yeah.
So it's wonderful to have opportunities like this, and I get opportunities to, and I still do a lot online because COVID is still around, unfortunately. So I do get invited to do online sessions, and so that's where and obviously in my memoirs, so to share what I think has helped me get to the point that I got to. It took time, and it took people pointing out when they felt that I wasn't doing it correctly, if you like. Yeah. So.
But it's so important and powerful. You know, I know we're kind of joking, and it's actually a very serious thing, the whole Meghan thing, but just to see people like you, people of your stature, that role modeling, that kind of license to give voice.
I'm really sorry, but doing stuff at home, my doorbell is going.
Oh. Well, listen, we better end there. No, we're right on time. I just want to thank you, Kim, for being here with us again today for this program. And Elizabeth, thank you so much. I just want to, before I finish, we've a lovely comment here from Annie Stratton. Wonderful conversation. Dame Elizabeth is a delightful, insightful storyteller. I am an American mixed race person, one of those down the line, generally taken for white. I am nearly 80 and spent a confused childhood until I put things together. My mother knew so much about Black culture and history and often commented on civil rights issues, yet never once talked about the clear Black heritage that showed in a photo of her family. One photo shows her mixed grandmother with her immigrant Gaelic grandfather, along with their children. To my surprise, I was eventually able to trace the family back to a Virginia family, both Black and white people. I love Dame Elizabeth's story of her discovery and of herself and related to us to it. Annie, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a lovely place for us to finish. And please, we didn't even tip the iceberg of what's in Dreams from My Mother. It is available on a audio book. I know they're very popular, and I think you read it yourself, did you?
Yes, yes. So if people want to hear my voice.
Yeah, that's beautiful because you have a lovely voice. So we're going to see if we can help to make it more widely available in print in the US.
It's on Kindle as well.
On Kindle as well.
Kindle and audiobook, we think, don't we, that it's available in the United States. But the paperback at the moment, if people want the paperback, maybe let Miriam know, and I can contact the publisher here
to get some pressure.
Available in the United States. Thank you.
Dame,
it's been a real pleasure.
It's been our pleasure, and keep doing what you're doing. And thank you for contributing to our Black, Brown and Green Voices program. This is a very special interview, and we're very, very honored to have included your voice in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And it's been a huge honor for me. And I've thoroughly enjoyed it, by the way.
Thank you. Have a great evening. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in December for Professor Herman D. Farrell, who's going to talk to us about his research on Eugene O'Neill and his own African Irish American heritage as well. So join us for that. Thank you so much.
I'm going to wave you bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks so much.